Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here, you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. This week's episode is a little different. Our question this week is from Aaron M., who wants to know, if Wakanda doesn't engage in world trade, how in the world are they rich? Vibranium isn't traded or sold, so how would they have capital with purchasing power outside of their own nation? Now, I can talk some about the history of Wakanda, but when we get into economics, that's outside my wheelhouse. So I've recruited Dr. Matt Dobra to discuss this question with me. Dr. Dobra has a PhD and MA in economics, and is currently an associate professor in the Reeves School of Business at Methodist University in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
So I've just listed off your economics credentials, but let's hear your comics credentials as well. What piqued your interest in comics and superheroes?
So while I've never really been a collector of comic books, I've always maintained an interest in following them. Growing up, I was always sort of into more, let's say, nerdy sort of endeavors. I was very into, say, Magic the Gathering. I was very into science fiction, but comic books were never really the thing that I was super excited about, really until I started to see the Marvel Cinematic Universe start to unfold. I would say that the show, or the thing that sort of hooked me into the Marvel Universe, was probably the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. of all things. And then once I started getting into the show, then I went and I watched, pretty much anything that I could find that was Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it just sort of snowballed from there. So for me, it's more of a recent understanding, but in a lot of ways, I'm very interested in understanding how economics permeates pop culture, right? Because as a teacher, that's one of the few ways that you can get your ideas across to students, is by showing them where these ideas that we talk about on a classroom chalkboard and they sort of seem esoteric. If you can show them that, hey, there's this show called The Black Panther, and by the way, you've all seen it, right? What about the economics in that? There's a whole lot of crazy stuff going on in that movie that really seems contrary to economic logic. Or my favorite one to talk about recently is when you watch Infinity War and you listen to Thanos give his spiel on why he's doing what he's doing. And by the way, Thanos thinks he's the good guy, right?
Right.
And you watch that and you say, okay, this thing that he's saying, this theory that he's promulgating about why he has to do the things he has to do to save the world, that all came out of a book written in 1798 by Thomas Malthus. And that is the logic that people have been using for the last 200 years to talk about why we're going to run out of this and we're going to run out of that. We have peak oil. It's the same story, right? Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb back in, I believe, 1968, that said that the world's going to end and we're all going to starve. And you know what? This is a story that economists have been arguing about for 230 years. And all of a sudden, here's Thanos that's saying the exact same thing. He's saying that the world's going to run out of resources unless we do something about the population, and we need to fix that now. And so here's a pop culture reference to a really interesting economic idea, a really interesting debate that's been going on for hundreds of years. I kind of feel like I need to use these stories from real life or from pop culture to really help students understand the relevance of economic ideas in the real world.
Oh, that's great. When we were talking before the show started, you did mention both of those ideas that you had brought up in your classroom, and I think that's a really good way of introducing those sorts of topics to students, especially those who may not be majoring in economics but are taking the class and want to know, well, what is this good for? Why do I need to learn this? And showing them that it is reflected in the things that they're watching and reading and listening to is a really strong way to make it personal for them and make them interested.
I think that's a better way of saying what I took far longer to say. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going for, right? This economics thing, it sounds boring, but the ideas are so important to your everyday life. And hey, guess what? They're important plot pieces to the movie that just sold $80 bazillion worth of stuff.
Now, bazillion, is that an economic term that I'm not familiar with?
It is. It's a unit of currency that you use to buy vibranium.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into Erin's question then, shall we? She wants to know how a country like Wakanda, that completely isolates itself from the world as much as possible, could be as well off and materially rich as they appear to be in the movie. Now, from my basic understanding of economics, I think the short answer is they can't. Am I right so far?
Well, I'm going to side with you, very broadly speaking. I don't think they can either. I think that there are a whole lot of economic and political and sort of the combination of the two problems, the political economy problems, that are really going to doom a country that Wakanda is supposed to be to not being able to live up in any way, shape, or form to the vision that we see in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
So let's start with some of the basics of why that wouldn't work. First off, Wakanda shows a lot of technological advancement that would seem to require more raw resources than just vibranium. A car needs glass, rubber, steel, etc., and we see no signs that Wakanda has other raw natural resources beyond the Great Mound.
Well, and beyond that, it's not just a question of resources, it's also a question of technology, it's a question of innovation. There's something a little bit fishy to me always when you look at a country that is completely isolated from the rest of the world and yet somehow develops technology that looks like that of the rest of the world. Like they're not in contact with, anybody else, but somehow they have cars and cell phones that somehow magically operate on the same frequencies as the ones in the rest of the world. Like there's something a bit contrived about that. So first of all, I think you have a very good point when it comes to what can Wakanda possibly produce that would allow them to have the economy that can make all of these things, right? So you think about iron. Iron, to my knowledge, is not going to be found in Wakanda, right? And maybe it might be worth asking the question just to start with, where is Wakanda and how big is it, right? So if you watch the movie, you read the books, they are very, very sort of guarded about it, right? We know that it's in equatorial Africa somewhere, right? And we don't know where.
Yeah, it's usually kind of placed around the same place as the Congo.
Right. And when I look at the imagery in the movie, I sort of think Rwanda. Rwanda does border the Congo, for what it's worth. So we're sort of really in the same sort of ballpark. If you're talking about that part of the world, right, you're talking about just smack dab in the middle of Africa. There's a lot of things that go along with being in that part of the world that are actually going to be extremely detrimental to growth anyway. The first thing that's detrimental to growth is that you're next door to the Congo. And Congo is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. You're next door to Tanzania. Things aren't fabulous in Tanzania. You're next door to Kenya. You're sort of surrounded by countries that aren't going to help you be very, proactive and growing. It also turns out that it's incredibly difficult to grow if you're a landlocked nation. If you look at the growth statistics around the world, landlocked nations grow more slowly than nations that have a coast, right? Because you need access to the rest of the world to trade. They don't have access to the rest of the world to trade. Even if they wanted to trade, they'd have to go through the Congo. And that's just not an easy proposition, and it's not going to be fantastic for their economic growth.
Now, they do have some contact with the rest of the world. For instance, both T'Chaka and T'Challa make appearances at the United Nations, and Martin Freeman's character, Everett Ross, has had dealings with Wakanda in the past. So, is it possible for a country like that isn't actively involved in trade, but has some diplomatic relations, as well as spies apparently around the world, as we see in the movie, to gain enough access to information to build the technology, like the cars and the phones that work with the rest of the world's systems? Or is that still insufficient to build the kinds of things we were talking about?
So the answer is, I think, a little more complex than what you're getting at. So first of all, would spies and whatnot be necessary? In a lot of ways, I would guess that a lot of Western countries that are rich are more than willing to give away technology to poor countries. So if everybody thinks that Wakanda is poor, I'm sure that there are people willing to give them technology, but not the good technology, right? They're not going to say, this is how you build, the brand new engine that goes in the 2009 whatever, right? That's not what they're going to give them for free. In order to have the level of economic attainment and the level of economic growth that's implied by the literature, they would need to be not just taking technology from other people, but quite honestly on the bleeding edge of technological innovation. Because sort of the lore of Wakanda is you go back in time to 1950 and it looks like everything around it, and then the vibranium comes about, and somehow from 1950 to today they become the richest country in the world by a wide margin, right? So they go literally from the poorest country to the richest country, more or less, in like 60 years. And, if you do some math, we're talking about a country that grew at 15, 20% per year. And that's possible if you're a poor country now. So if you look at that part of the world right now, Rwanda is doing something close to that. But they've been doing it for a few years. They didn't do that and sustain it over a 70, 80-year period. And beyond that, and this is where it sort of gets back into your question, they're not doing that, right? You can have high rates of economic growth when you start really poor, because then you're just copying what other people are doing. It's when you get into that really high level of economic attainment that having outrageous rates of economic growth is practically impossible.
When they're actually innovating themselves.
They would have to be. They would absolutely have to be. Because, their technology is clearly better than the technology of the rest of the world, right? So they're doing crazy things like curing cancer that the rest of the world just can't do. And you look at the science and tech that T'Challa's sister, whose name is escaping me right at this moment,
Sure.
Right? Right, sure, yeah, sure, you're right. The technology that she's showing these people is, mind-blowing to people from the West, scientists from the West. Their minds are blown. So they must be on the bleeding edge of innovation in order for them to be able to do what they're doing. And that gets all the way back to the beginning of, is such a thing possible? Ultimately, the main resource, the thing that drives economic growth is, do you have lots of really, really smart people innovating like crazy? And if it's a tiny country with 2 million people, something like that, and so many of them are, pastoral and farming and stuff like that, where are the scientists going to come from that are going to be innovating like crazy? How are they going to, in a country of, that represents, 1/5000th of the world population, going to be able to develop technologies that the rest of the world can't even fathom? That just seems really far-fetched to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. However, I wanted to bring up something that was in the movie and even included in the trailer. Everett Ross is interrogating Ulysses Claw, played by Andy Serkis. In that scene, Claw asks Ross what he knows about Wakanda, and he responds,
textiles, shepherds, cool outfits.
So, could Wakanda be able to get some of the resources necessary in order to create that technology and innovate the way they have through trade of simpler goods like the textiles mentioned, or even the trained rhinos?
I mean, who doesn't need a trained rhino? I think the problem that they're going to run into going that route is something that we call the Dutch disease. And the Dutch disease, it sounds like a crazy sort of thing, but the Dutch disease refers to what happens in an economy. It could be a poor economy, it could be a rich economy, when all of a sudden there's the discovery of an extremely, insanely valuable natural resource. It's called the Dutch disease because the first place it was noticed would have been back in the 1960s when there were huge deposits of natural gas discovered off the coast of the Netherlands. Probably the most recent place we've heard about it is in Canada when the oil sands sort of exploded, not literally, but hey, there's a bunch of oil up in Alberta.
I've also I've heard I've read a phrase called the resource trap. Is this would this be the same thing, or is that slightly different?
They're related. So I've actually written a couple of papers on this topic that have been published. The resource trap, or more aptly, I more often see it called the resource curse, has a number of different reasons why it happens. Dutch disease is one of them. The Dutch disease is one reason why the resource curse might affect rich countries. Most of the other rationales for the resource curse are why they would affect poor countries, and all of them could potentially come into play within the context of Wakanda. So yeah, you're exactly right. It is part of that sort of general story of resource curse. The Dutch disease specifically is if a country has this discovery, like I said, of a really, really valuable natural resource. And I don't think you could say that vibranium is not that. And what would happen is
it seems to be one of the most most valuable resources on the planet.
Yeah, for sure, right? It's, amazing. And so what would happen is in that context, in that discovery, you would see resources rushing to that industry, right? Everybody wants to be involved in pulling this vibranium out of the ground because that is the thing that's super valuable. At the same time, that's going to have, in the case of an economy that has trade, it's going to cause large fluctuations in the exchange rate. And that large fluctuation, basically an appreciation of the currency, is going to mean that it's almost impossible to export anything else, because that's going to mess with your prices. And so that's what was supposedly happening in Canada. That was what was supposedly happening in the Netherlands. But it's an exchange rate-based idea that says that if you have this natural resource that's super valuable, it's going to kill all of your other industries. So if vibranium is that amazing, which if it is, right, then they're not going to be exporting clothes for ridiculous prices either. It's going to be way more cost effective to import everything else. So getting into, since you mentioned the idea of the resource curse, there's a few different reasons why the resource curse might affect a country like Wakanda. The first is going to be that when you have large natural resources, it generally leads to low quality government, right? Governments that are corrupt. And, Wakanda is not a democracy, right? In the real Africa, there's one country that's not democratic. It's Swaziland. They have a king. He has 19 wives. I was reading about him today. Cool dude, right? So they are not a democratic country. And if you look around the world at the countries that do tend to have these vast natural resource deposits, especially ones that were discovered in the last 50 or so years, right? We're talking about countries like Venezuela. We're talking about countries like Saudi Arabia, where corruption sort of runs rampant. And what's going on here is that when an economy discovers these huge natural resources, it really empowers the government to be able to do whatever the heck they want without consequence because, if the economy tanks, they still have all this stuff that they can sell. So it really unhinges the government from having to make responsible decisions. Now, the way I think they wave their hands in the Black Panthers, they say, no, but T'Challa is like this wise warrior king, right? Like he's like this, Platonic philosopher king. He's the good guy, right? He's a rare exception.
Right. Yes, and T'Chaka before him, and
right.
down the line, apparently just this family has been very good at ruling all through the years.
And I mean, find me another example of that in the real world, right? So there just aren't many, if any, if I can think of. Generally speaking, you don't see that in the real world.
Since they don't actually trade in vibranium, and other trade items wouldn't be significant to their economic development because of that resource curse we talked about, is there any way that they could develop economically while holding that vibranium to themselves and only using it internally?
Well, Scrooge McDuck had his giant silo of money that he swum around in, right? It sitting there didn't do anything for him. It's only when that money goes out into the world that it can become something bigger than it is.
Now, moving on to a different subject, and one that could be somewhat controversial. It's stated in the movie that Wakanda, unlike almost every other country in Africa, did not experience the slave trade.
Oh, that's an excellent observation, yeah.
It's implied that's one of the reasons Wakanda is in a better position than other countries on the continent. Did losing so many healthy, functioning adults to slavery change things significantly in Africa? And is there any real-world equivalent that we can point to show that difference?
Sure, we actually do. We have one. If you'll indulge me, just a little bit of backstory on why the slave trade has such a big impact even to today. It has less to do, quite frankly, with the idea that young males who were, prime working age and super awesome were taken from Africa, but more about what was going on in Africa at the time of the slave trade. So these boats would come and they'd be full of Europeans saying, we want some slaves. And what ultimately happened was individual tribal groups or villages within Africa would go capture people from other groups and then put them on the boats. So they would be sold by one village, and really it's sort of the way that warfare turned into back in the 1800s, right? So we would raid one village, sell those people as slaves, and now we have a new village. So it was a form of conquest. And that's awful. So is the slave trade in and of itself, right? But ultimately what that did was it created a lot of, let's just say, hatred between rival groups within Africa. And when 1960 rolls around and every country in Africa becomes independent from, the European power, right? So the Congo became independent or were given their independence from Belgium in the early 1960s. Rwanda, which is another one of those sort of maybe it's Wakanda countries, was also a Belgian colony, and they became independent in the early 60s. And so when all of these countries become independent, you get this sort of tribalism of, we are just this group of villages that for 200 years have been trained to hate each other, and now we have to govern together, and it just creates a lot of political economy problems. The best counterexample, I would say, is Botswana. And Botswana is a lot farther south. It's right in the middle of southern Africa. It's just north of the country of South Africa. I believe Zambia and Namibia, but don't look it up on a map right now because I might be wrong on that. But it is probably the country that was the least affected by the slave trade in Africa, precisely because it was landlocked and there were no rivers to get there. So basically they were isolated from the coast by a very large margin. Botswana, back in 1950, was actually a very poor country, but maybe from the 70s onwards, has been one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. Their GDP per capita right now, just a ballpark figure, is going to be over 10,000, maybe even a bit higher than that. And it's probably the most well-off country in Africa. But that having been said, they're still a developing country. They're nowhere near, American levels of income. And America's not the richest country in the world either, right? Wakanda is supposed to be the richest by far. And so we're talking, Liechtenstein's like at $150,000 per capita GDP. They've got a long way to go if they want to hit that. So yes, there is that precedent for let's look at a country that wasn't affected negatively by colonialism and the slave trade. And yes, you're right. Your intuition is exactly correct. It does have a positive impact, but the real world example hasn't done nearly as well, sadly for them, as Wakanda.
Sadly, few have. Well, I think that just about covers it. I want to thank you for coming on to talk to me about this subject and answer Aaron's question, as well as all my follow-ups. And if another comic book economics question comes up down the line, we can talk again.
I'd be more than happy to. It's been fun.
Again, thank you to Dr. Matt Dobra for coming on the show. And thank you, Aaron, for the question that prompted this episode. If you have a question you want answered, or any other feedback you'd like to leave, please send me an email at welcometogeektown@gmail.com. Or leave a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcome2geektown.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and give me a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council to help other people find the show so we can all tell them,
Welcome to Geektown, population us.
Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.